Welcome to this wonderful room in the library. We're going to do an overview of buttons on your digital SLR so that you have a better sense of what they are. And some of you, I think, have just kind of forgotten what some buttons are. So this is just going to be an overview of how the D7000, D7100, and D7200 work. I have my trusty camera right here, so that's going to help me just kind of show you what we're doing here. And I'll just kind of give you an overview of the buttons by looking at this camera right here. So let's walk through just kind of your basics. So obviously you have your camera here. We're going to really worry about the top buttons first and the dial. So let's start with this top panel. So if you're on here, you obviously have your on and off button. One of the things you might not know about this is if you pull it further, you actually get a little light. So that's nice at night if you can't see what's on your screen. Okay, then there's a couple buttons here that are the main ones you're worried about. So first things first, if you're in manual exposure, you can change everything from your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture, but you can't do those if you're only in shutter priority or aperture priority, or this P stands for program, and it's basically like auto everything. The auto stands for like totally automatic, so that is gonna have everything like literally just be done for you. This is what you don't want to be on ever, because what's going to happen is you're going to get things like this automatic flash that pops up. So what you're going to want to be in is one of these. Now for sports, if you're in shutter priority, because you want to change your shutter speed, you change that to S. And then on the back here, notice if I rotate this back dial, so it's this dial right here, with my thumb, I change the shutter speed. Now for most sports, you're going to be okay if you're shooting at like, 1/500th of a second. But if it's a really fast sport, you might need to be up near like 1000. Now, if you are shooting a sport at night, you're going to need a really high ISO for that, because if you ever see this say low right here, low means it's underexposed. So if it's underexposed, then it's going to be too dark. Well, I don't have enough light in here. So what we need to do then is we need to go to the back of the camera and identify our ISO button. So our ISO button is right here. And if I hold that down with my thumb, keep holding it, if I go up to here, suddenly you'll see your ISO. And so with my ISO revealed, I can use this back dial, the same one as my shutter speed, that back dial, and I can change my ISO. For shooting, especially like if it's lacrosse, if it's something at night, you want to be shooting up around 2500. What you don't want to do is set that too high. Like if I go all the way up here, you might think, well, if 2500 is good, let me go really high. The problem with that is you're going to get a really noisy photo. So you want to watch out for that. So on these cameras, 2500 is pretty safe for shooting. And then you're going to be able to shoot in most conditions. Now, the reason mine still says low is because I have my lens cap on. If I were to take off my lens cap, you'll now notice if I tap here, it says f2.5, 2.8, so it's able to achieve proper exposure. So that's shutter priority. The other one that you want to be thinking about is aperture priority. So aperture priority is basically you setting your aperture as low as possible, and the computer is going to try to do your shutter speed. If you ever notice it say high, it means it's getting as high as it can achieve. So then you might have to back off your aperture, or again, go down to ISO, hold that down, and change your ISO to a little bit lower. And then you'll have a proper exposure there. And you'll notice the shutter speed's always changing when you're in aperture priority, because it's just reacting to whatever the light is around you. The mode I typically shoot in is manual exposure. So I turn this to the M here, that's manual exposure. And under manual exposure, you get to change everything on your camera. So the buttons here, this is shutter speed, this is aperture, this is how many pictures you have left. Mine says E because there's no memory card in there. But then you also have some different information here, which I'll show you in a second. So if I want to change my aperture, I can rotate this dial and that aperture changes, that f16. If I want to change my shutter speed, I can rotate this back dial and that changes. Now, one of the challenges of this is you're not sure if you have a proper exposure. So one place where we can look for that is on the back of the camera. if you tap your button and you don't see anything, you can always click this info button. So if I tap this info button, this gives me all the information and more of what's going on the front. What this is telling me right now is I have an underexposed picture. So the minus means it's underexposed. So part of what I want you to know how to do is adjust this to fix this exposure. So if it's underexposed, that means it's too dark. And if it's too dark, we need to adjust things to bring in more light. So in this case, we can adjust our aperture to bring in more light by increasing it, right? So we can make it a lower number, and that increases the size. So I went all the way down to f1.8, and you notice it helped it quite a bit, but it didn't go all the way down. So then I have to adjust my shutter speed. And to bring in more light, I have to lower my shutter speed. And now you know you have a perfect aperture, a perfect exposure, excuse me. The one other area where you could affect that, let's say you're shooting sports and you're like, wait, but I can't shoot at 200, that's too slow. Then what you really need to change is your ISO. So again, you can hold down ISO. Again, this is just a bigger illustration of what's on top. And I can now change this 800 up to what we'd shoot in a stadium, which is 2500. So if I have 2500 selected, you'll now notice I have an overexposed picture, which means I can adjust my shutter speed and get a really fast picture and still have a proper exposure. So that is what's telling you about your exposure settings, right? So that's how we can adjust our shutter speed, our aperture, and our ISO. And that's that information up at the top here. Now you get other information up here as well, right? So one bit of information that you want to understand is how fast you're shooting your pictures. So here you have a single shot, you have continuous low or continuous high. What that means is basically you can take pictures, and if you do on single shot, it'll just be one picture. Continuous low, you can hold down the shutter and it'll take a whole bunch of pictures. If you do it high, it takes like countless pictures. Also, you can set it to things like timer. So that's this dial, and to change it, you have to hold down this button on the side and then kind of with your other finger rotate it. So in sports especially, you want to keep it at continuous high. And then I've shown you this button on the top, right, this dial, but that changes from manual to aperture to shutter to program. Again, when you're getting better with your camera, you should be on manual exposure, but for sports, you can often stay on shutter exposure and let the camera do the other work. All right, let's jump to a different button that's really important in your photography, and that's right down here. It's a weird location for a button, but it's this one right here. And this one allows you to switch from autofocus to manual if you rotate that dial. It also, though, allows you to push it in and change basically where your focusing is. So if I hold this in with my thumb, on the back of my menu, you'll notice it highlights, there we go. On the back of my menu, you'll notice it highlights where I'm focusing. So with that button pushed in, I can actually change if I want autofocus single or continuous. I believe it's servo actually, and then continuous, and then auto. You want to leave that on continuous for sports. Then that's the back dial that changes that. So you see there, that's the back dial. On the front dial though, you can also change the area. So it says auto, it makes a smaller kind of area or a bigger area. This is by rotating the front one, changes your aperture. What you want to be thinking about here is what area do you want in focus? So for sports, oftentimes it's that dot right in the middle that you want in focus. Here's a trick that some people run into when they're doing this, and that is if you notice at some point your focus is over here, and if you look through the viewfinder, you'll actually see that the dot will be all the way over to the right or all the way over to the left, or potentially like up high or up low. Now that's a cool mechanism for allowing you to actually like focus on areas you want to focus on, but it's a pain if you accidentally change it and you don't know that you changed it. So to fix that, you have to go to this L over here, and if it's on L already, you have to go down to this dot, and that allows you to, again, while holding down the button on the front, change this area. And you want to set it right in the middle. Then if you go to this lock button and you flip that back, now it won't move no matter how much you push this button. So generally you want to keep that little lock button on L, and that will help you out here for taking pictures. The other things that you're seeing on the back here are just more information. So you have like white balance, you can leave that on auto. ISO, you know what that is. And then this is like your exposure area. So this little guy right here, that's telling you basically what the camera's using to understand what kind of exposure you want. So if that is not what you want, and again, that's pretty technical, you'll probably never need to change that, but you generally want to keep it wide like that. But you can always change that up at the top here. This is your exposure area button. And if I push this down, so if I look at my thing, I'm pushing that button down, and notice now that button has changed, and I can use this back dial to change that to different zones. If you're doing something where you need a really specific exposure, you can use it and do a little dot there, or a bigger dot, or the full frame. Okay, so that little dot can be important. The other button up here is one that you kind of want to be careful you don't accidentally click. So that's this guy right here. This one is a forced exposure. So if I hold this down, notice it says 0.0, and it shows me the same sign you see on that button. If I change that, what that's basically doing is right now it's saying I'm going to force this picture to be underexposed by 2. Or I'm going to force this picture to be underexposed by 5. Or if I go the other way, I'm going to force this picture to be overexposed up to 5. And that's like 5 stops. So you can play around with that and see what it does. It's actually really helpful in some situations, especially if you're like in the gym and it's too dark and you need to forcefully overexpose it. But generally, leave it off, and you'll know you accidentally turned it on. If you look on the top of your camera and you see, there we go, you see this little button. Let me bring that in closer. Let's see if it can focus. Yeah. So you can actually see a little version of this button. If you ever see that on here, just know that that means that your camera is forcefully over or underexposed. So you want to watch out for that. All right, so those are the general buttons. The last button I'll point out to you, let me reset my camera, is actually in the menu screen. Okay, and there's two things, and some of you don't know this because we never really went over it in class, but basically your memory card on your camera is full of like every picture you've ever taken. That needs to be cleaned every now and then, just like anything, and otherwise it'll fill up and you might need to wipe it away. So to wipe it away, you have to do something that's called formatting a memory card. So let me show you how you actually click that on here. So to format your memory card, and I don't have a memory card in here, so this will be interesting if it actually like lets me do it. But you click your menu button, which is this button right here on the back, and you could literally go through every picture and hold it down. Or when you're on here, you go under the gear, and up here it says format memory card. What that means is you're gonna like erase everything on your memory card, and it'll be a brand new kind of cleaned memory card. So every now and then, after like a lot of projects, you might want to format your memory card, and that clears things up. The other button that you want to watch out for is a sneaky thing that happens, and it's right here. So it's under the camera menu. It's like the little green camera, and it's called ISO sensitivity settings. You want to watch out for this button saying it's on. This is the auto ISO sensitivity control. So instead of you adjusting your ISO down here, it's going to always adjust it for you. And that can be helpful sometimes, but the big problem is you aren't in full control of your exposure then. And it's going to be really frustrating to try to set your aperture and your shutter speed to make a proper exposure. So if you ever see that, if you're ever having issues, I should say, with your ISO, or if you turn this on and you notice that when you go onto here, you're not able, let's say we're on here, and you're not able to adjust the ISO, or it says this, it says it'll be flashing ISO auto. That's telling you your ISO is on there and it's doing like an automatic registration. So watch out for that one because it can get really frustrating with what you're actually trying to do on your camera. So you go to ISO sensitivity, make sure that's turned off, and now you can manually adjust your ISO on your camera. Okay, that's a quick overview of the many buttons. There's a lot of other buttons on these Nikons. There's a ton you can actually do with them, but I'm not going to go over all of those buttons because that was already enough. And those are ones that I want you to check out and try to like make sure that you understand those buttons. We'll be practicing with them in class, but the key thing is that you know those buttons so that you can make proper exposures on your pictures. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have questions.